Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond this sound bites. Joining me by Zoom is Roger Allbee. He's got a very long, what he did, listen to this, author, cranberry exporter, agricultural banker, congressional staffer in Washington, D.C., secretary of the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and CEO of the Grace Cottage Family Healthcare and Hospice. Goodness, welcome, Roger.
It sounds like I couldn't keep a job.
Yeah, well, that you and me both. They kept moving me around state government.
Yeah.
Well, that's where Roger and I met each other when he was the secretary. Oh, were you commissioner or secretary?
I was secretary.
It was always secretary?
Changed the title.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I like that better. Anyway, he wrote a book, which I'm going to put up the picture in the video here. It's called Turning the Soil, 250 Years of Vermont Agriculture. I read it. Roger, it is fabulous.
Well, thank you, Pat.
And you would think, it's so interesting how we evolved to where we are today. From something I had to look up, you're going to have to tell us what potash is. I had to actually look that up, just for the record. Shows you my background. But anyway, could you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I've been fortunate in life. I grew up on a small hilltop farm in Brookline, Vermont, not Brookline, Mass. Brookline, Vermont.
Yeah, let's get that right.
In southern Vermont in Windham County. I was born in 1945. The farm I grew up on was a small hilltop dairy farm. My grandfather ran the dairy, and my father and uncle had a sawmill that was next to the farm, and then they had a sugar operation as well, and I worked in all these things in my youth. And after that, of course, I went to a one-room school for
Great.
8 years.
Excellent.
Not many do that today.
No.
And then high school, and then the University of Vermont. And after that, I did my military commission and ended up in West Germany, actually in tactical nuclear weapons of all things, which I was responsible for with NATO.
Good grief.
And came back to graduate school, and then did some work for Cornell University as a so-called Sea Grant specialist in marine areas. And then came back to Vermont and was asked to head up the 208 non-point source pollution project after the 1972 Clean Water Act was passed, and they required the states to develop policies for dealing with non-point source pollution at that time. And then worked for the Governor Snelling's Commission on Forestry and Taxation that he created to develop the Ag Forestry and Taxation Program. And then Jim Jeffords asked me to come to D.C. to work with him as a staff on the House Ag Committee, responsible for dairy policy pretty much.
That's a surprise.
Jim was the dairy expert in Congress at that time. And everyone recognized him on both sides as being the dairy expert. And then I was hired by the Farm Credit Banks that cover, in the Bank for Cooperatives, that cover farm lending and cooperative lending in the Northeast. And then we merged the banks with a bank in Denver, and I developed a trade export company with a colleague for value-added products, and developed those in Europe and emerging markets that came, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic then. And then did some work as a marketing specialist for a DC law firm. Was the animal and animal products trade chairman, trade advisor to the U.S. trade ambassador and the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture at one time, and then came back to Vermont and was asked to head up the USDA Farm Service Agency. And then Jim Douglas asked me to become Ag Secretary from Vermont, which when I was first asked to do it, I said, no, I don't think so.
Maybe not.
I'll give you, and they came back and said, please do it. And I said, of course. Anyhow,
It's hard to say no to any governor when they ask you that
absolutely,
stuff. Like, oh,
especially Jim
Jim,
Douglas.
but we need you. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's a
yeah,
good guy.
yeah.
Well, I must say, I've been doing this show for 15 years, and this is the truth. I have never seen anybody that I remember with a biography like yours. You
Well,
have,
as I said, I couldn't keep a job, right?
that's me too. I was on the TV this morning, and he was asking me about how many jobs I've had. I have the winning record for the most jobs in state government. Tom Torty was right
Oh my
behind me,
gosh.
but I'm it.
Oh, Tom,
Yeah,
sure.
he was right
Yeah,
behind me. I think I'm 2 jobs
right
ahead
behind.
of him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Anyway, can you imagine?
Oh,
They moved me around, and the big thing was she can't keep a job. So there you go. But we're still here. So why?
that's right.
What made you, with all this stuff you're doing, what made you want to write a book in such unbelievable detail?
Well, it was a passion of mine, and I'll give you a little bit of background. So when I worked for Jim um, Douglas as Ag Secretary, you know the building. It's the old National Life building
Yeah,
on State Street in Montpelier, and in the building there's 2 big safes,
that's
and
right.
huge old safes. And actually, I used to say sometimes maybe I should have locked some people in it, but I didn't.
You had a good group there. You
We
did.
did
You
a
did.
wonderful group of
Yeah.
people to work with. And anyhow, in those safes, they had some of the old yearbooks of agriculture going back to the 1800s and up in today. And my wife wasn't with me some of that time I was there. So I'd go in the evening and read these old
Great.
yearbooks because I believe that to understand the future, you have to appreciate the
There you
past
go.
and know what's going on. So I did that, and also growing up on the hilltop farm in Brookline, my ancestors had started farming there in 17, 1794, and they're still farming today by the
Nice.
same name, same ancestors that started that farm, probably the last generation to do so. And we turn this off. And anyhow, so the book really started as a way to capture why those changes have taken place over this long period of time. In fact, my first day of the job was for Jim Douglas in Montpelier, 2006. Just before that, the state legislature had provided the farmers with, I think, $6 million
Whoa.
because of the downturn in prices. And my first day in the job, one of the co-op leaders called me and said, Roger, can you go to the governor and the legislative leadership and ask if they can give us more money? We
Whoa.
need it.
That's a lot of
Uh,
money back then, too,
yeah,
right?
we need it. And I said, gee, this isn't going to help you because it's going to create the image that you can't survive as
Uh-oh.
dairy farmers,
Right.
and with these down and he said, please, I'm begging. So I went to Jim Douglas, and he went to the legislative leadership, and they said, yeah, this one last time,
Oh, excellent. Good for you.
one last time, and I think it was 3 million or so on top
Oh,
of that.
that's a great way
Uh,
to start your job,
yeah,
getting 3
but
million more.
the point is that I knew the dairy economics from my background and working in DC and all
Yep.
that, but that just forestalled the inevitable in some ways because yeah, I mean we don't today, Pat. We don't have any dairy co-op that is headquartered in the state of Vermont. I mean,
Is that
we all know
right?
about Cabot.
Yep.
That's right. We know about Cabot. I was working with Farm Credit when Cabot went
Huh.
bankrupt and Agrimark was put together in about 1995 because they failed. And as you know, and these are wonderful people, all
Right.
of them.
Oh, yeah.
And then, as we know, what happened to St. Albans Cooperative, the same
Yep.
thing
Right.
happened. We have some wonderful dairy farmers. in the state. They work very hard, their families.
For sure.
But the trend on dairy economics works works against our farmers in the Northeast because today um, I saw these stats. 60% of our milk is by farms over 2,500 dairy cows, and 70% is by farms over 1,000 dairy cows.
Wow.
So it's hard to have the scale of operations
Yep.
in Vermont as you have in the Midwest.
Yeah.
As,
And
as great as these producers are.
as you're talking, I was thinking we also don't have, I think we have maybe one farmer in the legislature. And
That's right.
that is such a
That
bad thing.
absolutely.
We really need
That's
the
right.
farmers, because when I was
That's right.
in there, you always heard the farmers stood up and they said, here's what we need and
Yeah.
here's what's happening.
Yeah.
There's nobody, I don't
Yeah.
think. Is there anybody?
Well,
I don't think.
yeah, there is.
Is there?
There's what's his name from Northeast Kingdom
Oh, good.
on the House Ag Committee that is there, but
Oh,
by and
I'll have to
large,
check
there's
that out.
not
No. Yeah, there was a whole bunch of them.
many voices.
No, there was a whole bunch that sat in the back of the house, and they were all always chatting and gabbing and speaking up. It was great
yeah.
because they knew what they were
then
talking
you have,
about.
then you have, whether you agree or not with Bobby Starr. Bobby Starr was always there fighting.
For sure, with his Vermont accent that came and went for the occasion.
Right. Right.
He was a killer, that man. I loved him. He talked one time in committee about getting arrested. He had
Oh, really?
he had everybody on the floor just crack it up. It was unbelievable. He couldn't have cared less. Yeah, I got arrested. Blah blah blah. I'm sorry he retired. I'm sure he deserved it, but anyway.
Well, he deserved it.
Yeah, he did.
Yes,
He worked
that's right.
hard. He was
Yeah.
a good guy.
Yeah.
Anyway. So I'm just going to read one paragraph because I wanted to set the framework for your book, because you touch on so many things. And the book and the preface says, Vermont has always had a rich agricultural history with many products harvested from the land. Change has been inevitable, arising from many factors, including transportation, geography, soil types, competition, markets, family values, management skills, public policies and programs, and research and education. And you pretty much touch on all these things in your book. You must have done a lot of research.
I did. I got all the old yearbooks of agriculture
Yeah.
that I researched. And the other thing is, it's very interesting. One of the things that happened early on, about 1895, two things happened during that period of time. We had a board of agriculture up into the early 1900s, and it was chaired by the governor and then appointed people on that board. And they went around and had hearings around the state. And one of the things that they, and somewhat interesting stories related to that period, in about 1898, there was a great concern about the loss of hilltop farms in Vermont, because even before the Civil War, there was a great outmigration of Vermonters to the West. Had been going on for some time. And so the hilltop farms were becoming farms that were losing people living on those farms. And the legislature, as well as the State Board of Agriculture, became very concerned. And there was a senator from Bennington, Vermont, Alonzo Valentine.
Oh, I remember that name.
Remember that?
Yeah.
He was very, very successful business person.
Yeah.
Had a knitting mill, and he was a state senator. And the governor at the time was a governor named Dillingham. And they wanted to find a way to repopulate these hilltop farms that were being lost. And so Valentine decided that the best way to do that was to see the way to bring in people from other countries.
Yes.
They were very concerned, or he was, and the governor and a few others, that the farms that were being bought up, especially in northern Vermont, were being populated by French Canadians
Yep.
and Irish people.
That's right, Irish. I
You
like
remember that
seeing that.
story?
Yeah, so I
Yeah,
was reading it in your book. Yeah.
yeah, and because by 1840 in Vermont, 40% of our population were either first or second generation French Canadians,
Wow.
according to history.
Huh.
And so they felt that that was not the population they wanted on these farms. So they decided to go to Sweden,
Yep.
and they wanted to bring some
Swedes
Swedish
over here, right?
people over here because they were Protestant and they were hardworking, and they thought and they did. They
Yep.
brought several families over, and they were located in Wilmington and Weston and
Nice.
Berkshire, Vermont. And
Excellent.
they were very, but it didn't work for them to take over hilltop farms because they found other means of employment that were more uh, brought better
Lucrative.
economics to them.
Lucrative. There you go.
Lucrative.
Yeah.
But and at the same time, there was a great deal of work to advertise these hilltop farms. In fact, a little publication that they did in
Oh,
1895 to said fertile farms and summer homes. So they advertised to bring sell these farms and other things to people from the cities to bring them to Vermont. So this whole issue of saving farms and saving farmland brings us to the present time when Vermont created the land trust and
right.
VHCB and these
Yep.
programs to
Yeah.
somewhat do the same
Right.
thing.
And
Yeah.
now we're still asking people to come to Vermont, right? But
Absolutely.
now there's no
And we
place for
had
them to live, right?
the first publicity bureau of any state in the country about 1911.
Oh,
Any
really?
state. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. I love
Yeah.
Vermont, may I say.
Yeah.
Politically, I argue every once in a while, but generally speaking, the people and the whole state is just, I feel good being here.
Absolutely.
So what I thought
Yep.
we would do, Roger, is just take this chapter by chapter. There are 10, I believe. And if I can give you the title of it, maybe we can talk about what was in that chapter, because it really follows this progression. And I don't want to say it's a natural progression, but it sort of feels like somebody was watching over us. And when this started not to work, something else happened. And I guess it's because we're a hardy group, and
Yep.
we just find something else to do. So your first chapter was entitled Clearing the Land, Subsistence Farming, and the Potash Trade. And that was in 1766. Governor Wentworth was offering cheap land grants, and they came. So
They did. They did. They were offering land grants. He was the governor of New Hampshire,
right,
and offering land grants that became a battle with New York at the same time because New York claimed many of the lands as well.
yep,
My ancestors, of course, came up from Massachusetts and settled one of these land grants in Newfane, or what was no Fane then, and others did at about the same time after the French and Indian War. And the first thing it did was cut the trees to clear the land.
yeah.
But like some of the old stories is that the first generation cut the trees and cleared the land. The second generation pulled the stumps, and the third generation farmed.
Oh, that's great. I love it.
Probably some truth to that. But one of the things that they did was to burn the hardwood trees, and they had big pots, and they burned the trees and put water through the ashes, and that's actually lye that they
Yep.
make. And they baked it and they chipped it off, and that was the first income because English paid them about $5 for every 100 pounds of lye that they
Right.
shipped, and many times they bartered for that lye, and that's how they made income. And that lye was sent to England, where they used it to clean wool and make soap and candles and other products. And they learned from that very soon that that couldn't be sustained because eventually there was another process that was developed for making lye out of seawater.
Oh,
and
right. I
the
read that.
economics
Right.
collapsed, and so that's an example of how, depending on a product that is influenced by economics in other parts of the world,
Right.
and the same happened with sheep
Yep.
later on, and the
Yep.
same happened with other products, and the same is happening with dairy today.
Yeah. Oh, I know it's really bad.
Yeah.
So is potash ashes in pot? You just said the word pot, and I thought is that where that word came from?
Well,
Sort of because
it's called potash because
potash.
you use the pot to bake it down and
Yeah,
to make it into a product.
I
Yeah.
just got that.
Yeah.
I had to look it up, and then they called.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
And then, although my house in New Jersey had the coal bins downstairs, and they
Sure. Yeah.
weren't using coal, but the bins were there, and all the dirt was there. So
Yeah.
maybe that was our potash. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But later they would call it pearl ash. Was that a
Well,
different?
the pearl ash was more of a making it more refined. And it was
Oh,
the first pearl ash was a patent process where they used like a kiln
oh,
to take the product and bake it in high temperatures, and it took some of the impurities out. In fact, the first patent in the United States for that product was, I guess, made by given to a Vermonter. Some debate about that, by George Washington. The first
oh.
patent in uh, provided in the United States.
Yep. Wow,
Yeah,
that's pretty
yeah,
cool. So then
yeah.
moving on to chapter 2, and what we just talked about is maybe 1/10 of what's in that chapter. Everything is so, I was fascinated, and I read it faster than because I just couldn't put it down. You know, I was dragging it all over the house with me. I'm cooking dinner and I got the book here. So it was very interesting. Chapter 2 says commercial farming and the development of trade networks, which was very important for moving all this stuff. So maybe you could talk about that.
Well, yeah, one of of course, transportation becomes very important in the
Right.
whole movement of product. And the first transportation, of course, was building roads. And uh, and one of the laws that was passed in the 1700s was that if you were an able-bodied man, you had to provide at least, I guess, 2 days of work
Huh.
in the town for building roads.
Oh, really?
And turnpikes became a very, very important part of early transportation.
Huh.
The legislature provided that turnpikes could be established for that purpose. And then at the same time, canals. Vermont
Right.
had
Right.
probably the first canal on the Connecticut River, Bellas Falls being the first canal built in the USA. And the canal system became a very important part of transportation on on the east coast of Vermont, all the way down to the Long Island, and then eventually on the western side, you had the Champlain Canal,
Yep.
1823, and the Erie Canal, and that
Oh.
opened the West. And at one time there was a proposal to build the Onion River Canal to connect the Connecticut River with Lake Champlain, but
Ooh.
they couldn't do it because of elevation. Um,
Oh,
but
interesting. That'd be cool.
canal system really opened the West, to increase competition for the East, because once the canal system, the Erie Canal, was built, um, it became very profitable to ship grain and other things
Right.
to the East Coast from the West, much cheaper than you could
Right.
before.
And then you didn't
Yeah,
write much about railroads, but I have down here 1840s, the railroad came in, and
yeah.
that must have
Railroads
changed
really
things.
changed things
Yep.
remarkably because, for example, before that time, it was very difficult to ship. Let's take by 18 capital of almost of the U.S. and the world. St. Albans was really where much of the butter was produced at that time, and uh, and people would come from all over to buy butter at St. Albans.
Wow.
And before the railroads, that was shipped by ship, but with the railroads, they had a railroad car going to Boston once a week. And these railroad cars were made so they had two walls, and then they'd put ice between the walls to create a
Oh,
cooling system.
right.
And they were shipping butter to Boston from St. Albans. And the railroads, and then, three things happened in 1862 besides the beginning of the Civil War. And one of the things that Abraham Lincoln did was to sign the Intercontinental Railroad Act that connected the East and the West Coast,
Wow.
that really brought Western products to the Northeast. The other was the Homestead Act, where veterans and others could get 160 acres of land out
That's right.
west,
How wild.
and if they improved it over 5 years, it would be free. And the third was the Land Grant Act, which
That's right.
like the University of Vermont
Right.
and all that really brought increased what I would say attention to farm development all through the
Yeah.
country.
That's great. And then in the same chapter, you talk about how we sort of messed things up a little bit because I guess we didn't know much about soil conservation, about how to, keep the soil rich and usable. And they had declining yields. And so they had to come up with another plan. And they picked on sheep, merino sheep.
Yeah, merino
That's
sheep.
a great story.
Yeah, merino sheep. That's a very interesting story because at the time there was a gentleman named William Jarvis, but he wasn't the first actually. A guy named Humphreys, who had been aide de camp to George Washington, actually was the first to bring merino sheep in, and they were very prized because they were sheep owned by the Spanish nobility,
Right.
and they not many were allowed to go anywhere, mainly because of the ability of these sheep to have fine wool and fleece and all that. But when Napoleon invaded Portugal and Spain, they didn't want the sheep to fall into the hands of him. So they allowed some to come to the United
Yeah.
States, and William Jarvis had been appointed um, consul to Spain and
Yes.
Portugal
Right.
by Jefferson, and he settled on Wethersfield, Vermont, to bring these sheep in. And why Wethersfield? Mainly because he had an
Right.
uncle in
Uh,
Claremont, New Hampshire, and a cousin
Close
there,
by.
and he became the Ben and Jerry's of the
Oh,
merino
of the
sheep
sheep.
industry. And they very quickly became, because Vermont had the cleared land and sheep grazed very nicely on grass that Vermont could grow quickly and easily
Nice. Right.
on these cleared lands.
Yeah.
And Vermont became known for its merino sheep. But the problem was it didn't last because it depended upon a high tariff after the War of 1812.
Ooh, there's a word we've
Congress,
heard lately.
yeah, Congress, Congress put tariffs on
Oh,
importation
great.
of products from Great Britain, and wool was one of those that they put a high tariff on. So
Wonderful.
farmers enjoyed pretty high prices. But by 1840, there was a great deal of conflict between the South and the North over these tariffs because the South produced cotton, and they
Ah,
they
right.
were losing market because the British were buying cotton before that.
Oh,
And
wow.
now they weren't able to, and the Northeast benefited from high tariffs on wool. So sounds familiar.
Yeah, I
So
was going to say nothing changes, does it?
nothing changed. So quickly, Congress eliminated those tariffs, and Vermont lost its competitive advantage.
Huh.
But it came back for the Civil War because of uniforms and the need for
Oh, right. They
uniforms.
were
But
all wool,
they
right?
were all well. But
Everything.
after that, it again declined because they could produce sheep, and cost of producing sheep in the West was about 50 cents to 75 cents a head. In the Northeast, it was $1.50 to $2 per head to do.
Huh.
But Addison County still used breeding stock and became some of the farmers there very wealthy by breeding. But eventually we lost our competitive advantage, and then that's when we moved to dairy production.
Dairy, right. Because
Yeah.
chapter 4, although I will, let me just, a real quick story. I told you, I think that we camped in Gettysburg for many years
Yes,
in the
yeah.
summer. And of course, they had the reenactment, the Battle of Gettysburg. And all of the soldiers were in the woolen
Yep.
clothes in July, in the hottest days of Gettysburg,
Yeah.
100 and something. And
Yeah.
some of them camped in our campground. Oh my God, when they would come home, they said they lose 10 pounds every time because the
Yeah.
wool would just destroy them. I bet they were glad
Yeah.
when they finally figured out how to use cotton, because that was a better thing. Because
Yeah.
everything was their undergarments, everything was wool.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I used to watch them hang their stuff up on the line, and it would just be, oh, yuck.
Yeah.
Not me.
You got it.
And anyway, so chapter 4 says commercial butter, and I always eat real butter. May I just say, no margarine, no nothing, butter, and cheese. I don't know how to cook a meal without cheese. Just
Did you ever remember when there was a conflict between real butter and margarine?
Oh yes,
When they had, and that's an interesting story about that, because what happened was that in the mid to late 1800s, Napoleon, I guess the third or so, wanted to find a way to get a source of fats for his troops and for the general population, and he put out an award for somebody to develop a artificial means to do that, and that's when scientists discovered how to make margarine
right.
out of animal renderings, basically. And quickly it spread to the U.S. The patent did, and states like Vermont and other states that were big butter producers basically said, "Well, we can find a way to stop this," and so they joined together and said, "We're going to require that the item be colored pink before it can be
That'll
sold."
turn you off.
Yeah, in the U.S. Supreme Court, went all the way to U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, "No, you can't do that, because under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, you can't prohibit trade between the states unless it affects human health, and you can't demonstrate that it's affecting human health. So the product has to be sold in its original color, which was white."
Right.
And the margarine industry got very smart, and they said, "Well, we can beat this one, so we're going to ship it in the original white color, but beside that, we're going to sell these little color packs that the
That are
consumer
yellow."
can mix together."
That's cool.
Yellow.
Yeah, you've got a little subsection in here that called the margarine wars. And
Yes.
after I listened a little bit about what margarine is made of, we just switched to butter. We weren't eating it for a while, but you can't mess with butter. You have to just eat the real thing or forget it.
I
You know?
totally agree. But the margarine today, of course, isn't made by animal renderings like it was at one time. So
Don't tell me.
it's different. but still,
All
real
right.
butter is the best.
All right,
Absolutely.
what is it made of? I shouldn't ask this question. I'm going to regret it.
It's made of different grains and stuff like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But I'm still going to eat it because it's healthier.
Hydrogen. Yeah.
Because they've got
It's
they've got chemicals and stuff in margarine, don't they?
But real butter is the best.
Yeah, it is.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And it's better to cook with it too, because it makes everything taste better. So anyway, so we learned our lesson. And the next chapter, which is fascinating because that's agricultural research and education, and how to educate farmers on how to take care of their land. And I'm sure crop rotation and how did that all start? When we realized?
Well, before the Land Grant Act was passed and signed into law by by our senator at the time, U.S. Senator Justin Morrill, a senator from Vermont. Grew up in Stratford, Vermont.
Oh,
Was a shopkeeper,
yeah.
and he when he went to Congress from Vermont, he understood the need for uh, better education for people, because before that time, uh, if you wanted a higher education, you went to one of the elite schools like Harvard or Yale or
Yep.
other places, and either law or medicine or something else, and you had to have money and
Don't you
a
always, right?
way. Yeah. So he had this idea. It wasn't just his, of course. Before his time, George Washington even came up with the idea of a institution of higher education. And his first thought was to create something like the military academies
Oh,
for,
really?
for
Now,
agriculture and for those who want to get
now
ahead. But
UVM was in here somewhere
yeah,
along where.
I'll get
Oh,
into
okay. Sorry,
UVM,
I was just.
how that happened. And so he had the idea um, to use the sale of Midwestern land that had formerly been land of Native Americans, to finance the establishment of land grant institutions across the country. Others had the same idea. The president of Cornell had this idea. Turner from Illinois had the idea. Even the president of Norwich University at the time. And so they developed this bill, and it passed in 1863, mainly because the South had left being part of the Union. So the South had opposed it up until that time because they thought it was more of the taking uh, and giving more power to the federal government than they wanted to give to the federal government
Right,
at the
right.
time. And so it passed in 1862, and by 1863, Vermont was the first state, or one of the first states to endorse becoming a land grant. It wasn't easy because Justin Morrill actually wanted three institutions in Vermont to be one land grant. He wanted Middlebury and Norwich University and
That's it.
UVM to be one land grant, because at that time UVM was a private institution.
Oh,
It wasn't public. And so there was a great deal of debate over that. In fact, the state legislature did pass a law enabling the three institutions to be one land grant in the state. But Middlebury wasn't inclined to want to go that way. Norwich was, by the way, and UVM was too. But in the end, UVM decided to become a land grant, and and to do that, each state got 30,000 acres of
wow.
land for each member of Congress they had. So Vermont,
99.
UVM got, and, and Vermont sold scripts to do that because we
Great.
didn't have land within the state.
Right.
And UVM got that and became a land grant, but it wasn't easy sailing because what happened is, even though Vermont became a land grant institution, and they didn't graduate anyone in the land grant college from 1863 to 1890.
Huh.
And so the Grange, which was very powerful at that time, um, wanted to take the land grant status away from UVM, and they
Wow.
developed a very spirited campaign to do that. And
Interesting.
and they basically got the law passed to change that in the House, but the Senate was not in favor of it,
Huh.
and UVM agreed to clean up their act after that and become a land grant. It wasn't unusual for that to happen because Dartmouth in the beginning was a land grant.
Were there too many
Brown,
were there too many restrictions that they didn't want
well,
to
it
meet,
wasn't
or?
so much the restrictions, but these institutions that had higher education and didn't really have any connection to the farm community,
Oh,
didn't really have good relationships
ah,
with the farm community. So the UVM's relationship to the farm community really didn't take off until 1914 or so, when the Federal Extension Service was created, that created the
interesting.
County Extension Service.
Huh. Well, UVM's doing okay now. So they all are.
They-
Middlebury and Norwich,
Yeah, yeah,
they're
yeah,
incredible.
yeah,
I
yeah,
love them, especially Norwich. I get a big kick out of Norwich, just what they
yeah,
do and what their purpose is. So
yeah.
anyway,
First private military
yeah,
institution in the United
yes.
States.
When
Yep.
they have a Labor Day parade, and we're in Northfield in the bottom, where in town, and
Yeah,
they come over this hill marching, all
yeah,
in their dress
yeah,
whites, I think. And
yeah,
I actually cry sometimes because it's so powerful. From a
yeah,
love country mom apple pie, I just
yeah,
love to
yeah,
watch them. It's just so
yeah,
powerful. It's
yeah.
great. Good job. All right, so now we're on chapter 6. We have 17 minutes. One of us is going to have to.
Ah,
So after this, I think maybe we'll just skip to what you would like people to know, because we're not going to make it. But chapter 6 says, which is sad, rural life in crisis. And what could you talk a little bit about? Oh, this is when they were talking about bringing the people from Sweden in. So we may have
yeah,
really touched on that already. And unless there's something I remember. When you were there, was David Kelly, was Mr. Kelly working there?
no, he's before me, but
Oh, was
he
he?
was a gentleman who had a great deal of insight and
Yep.
passion for developing value-added
Yeah.
products and
Well,
marketing.
I
Yeah,
went there one time because at that time I was commissioner of personnel, and I walked in and they had shelves all on your floor where your office was, all
yeah,
full of jellies and jams and cheese
yep,
and just showing what those products were. And it was, I remember that to this day, because it was like, wow, it's not just milk or cows or whatever. There was so much stuff we were making. It's really cool. And
no,
I think he was
products and
going down to
marketing.
New York a lot to market
Yep,
and do all that
yep,
stuff.
yep, yep.
Cool. All right, and I found in this the rural life. If you could talk a little bit about the importance of the church, which I thought was the country church, which was sort of the center of our
Yeah,
life back then.
yeah, yeah. The Country Life Commission and was a very important um, that Teddy Roosevelt had created
Hmm.
to because as the West was settled, and pretty much by 1900 they had said that the West is settled, and there was a great deal of concern about how rural lifestyles were being changed across the country. So Teddy Roosevelt created the Country Life Commission and said that there's things that need to be done to bring back
Right,
the country life that existed previously, and some of the emphasis was that that the country church was losing its ability to really help bring back the rural lifestyle that existed
mm-hmm.
before, and so there was an attempt to focus on how could that be brought back in some way um, through a country church that could focus on developing the co-ops and marketing and bringing the community get together.
Right,
And even at that time, there was an attempt to send a group of U.S. Experts and some Canadian experts to Europe in 1913. And they
huh,
went in a 6-month period throughout Europe and came back and basically recommended that farmer co-ops be established to help bring back uh, the communities through cooperative among farmers
right,
and
right.
groups that and much of that effort is resulted in some of the things that we have today.
Yeah. Roger, when did the Grange, the Grange take hold?
About 1860, 1880, it was 1880 was very powerful, and they became the Grange was a very powerful network
Right.
by 1890. And in fact, comically, today, uh, I don't mean to say this negatively about the Grange, but I had a friend years ago who uh, told me that she went to the Grange and wanted to become a member. And they said, you can't, you're too radical. And I said, boy, they don't know their history.
Yeah,
They took on the railroads, they
right,
took on,
right.
all those things. They were very, very
They had
um,
they had the power, didn't
powerful.
they? Yeah.
Yeah,
But we've got a
yeah,
Grange right here in Berlin, and
yeah,
we all contributed to getting a new floor for it. They've got
yeah,
square dancing. They have. I
yeah,
went and did canning. Took canning
yeah,
lessons there one
yeah,
time, and
yeah,
they allow us in Berlin to have meetings there to
yeah.
use it, and of course they have the Grange, so it's
But they
love it.
were very powerful by
Yeah.
1890. And Vermont had the first Grange in New England of any
Oh,
state. Yeah,
nice. Well,
yeah,
I just get a big kick out of when they talk about what they do because there's so much history.
yeah.
And as you said,
But
they
they were
were,
very, very, very powerful. So
yeah.
I said to him, I said, you don't understand. They took on the railroads, and they were,
No, no, the Grange. Yeah, well, they're wonderful people, and
yeah,
we get along with them really well in town. So,
yeah,
as this chapter 7 talks about cooperation and regulation, and somewhere in here is also competition, because things are starting to kind of cause a little trouble, I think, for us. And there's a lot of acts that were passed in Congress. The Sherman antitrust, just a lot of stuff to try to
yeah,
smooth
yeah,
things out.
yeah, and to some extent, it comes back to some of the things that may exist today. For example, in early 1900, of course, there was a great concern about power being existed in a few people across the United States, the so-called robber barons.
Mm-hmm.
And Teddy Roosevelt took on Standard Oil in
Good
terms
Teddy.
of trust busting and others. And then out of that, you had the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Sherman Antitrust
Yeah.
Act, eventually the Capra-Volstead Act that gave farmer cooperatives limited antitrust power
Ah,
against because farmers were being threatened by saying if you work together to market things together, you're violating antitrust laws. So
huh.
they had to pass Capra-Volstead to give farmers some immunity, limited immunity against that, and that basically allowed farmer cooperatives to exist as they do today to do that. And then you come folks go today and you look at what's happened in the food system and there's what 80% of the beef and meat processing is owned by 3 or 4 companies in the world
Yeah.
and there's only 4 companies that control most of the seeds and fertilizers
Yeah.
and the centralization today of the whole food system is and even in the retail food side, there's 3 retailers that control 50% of the
Yep.
retail. Walmart controls 23% of
Yep.
the retail food sales. So the consolidation comes back today of what we had in the early 1900s.
Well, I think I mentioned to you in one of my emails, one thing that drives me crazy, this is off this topic, but every time I have somebody from the food bank or somebody who's got a
Yeah,
kitchen, food, in Vermont, an agricultural state, one
yeah,
out of every 3 Vermonters deal with food insufficiency.
absolutely.
How the heck can that be in this state? It drives me crazy. What's happening? I don't want to get you off the book because I want to talk about it.
No,
But
well,
I
that's an
mention it.
interesting.
I mention
Yeah,
it all the time when somebody's on that would know, and sometimes it's been 1 in 4, 1 in 3. I mean, come
yeah,
on.
yeah. Well,
Anyway,
I remember when I ran Grace Cottage Hospital and healthcare facility, we'd have people back then, they had to choose between whether they could afford their food or for getting their medicine. Yeah.
Awful. That's just awful. That just presses all my buttons. Anyway, we only have about, I think, 8 minutes, which is not much time. Is there anything in the next couple of chapters that you would particularly maybe talk about the ski areas and what happened to that, and good old milk and milk pricing? I mean, that every year I was in state government, that was the topic, was milk prices for our farmers to.
Well, the pricing of milk on the non organic side and goes back to 1937, New
Oh,
Deal, and I always said that it's a complicated pricing system that only 3 people understand. 2 of them are dead, and the third has Alzheimer's.
that sounds about right. Yeah, because
But
you were
it's a very
always fighting about it.
It's a complicated
Yeah.
system that exists and there's a resistance to change, not because people know it needs to be changed, but because of the whole political infrastructure that exists to resist change.
Right. But they really need,
Especially,
they need that
yeah,
increase. I mean, they're not like you were telling about your friend that said giving us money.
absolutely,
Yeah. Do you know what?
absolutely. But the, the whole infrastructure that exists that oppose it, especially, as milk production has moved westward and you've got these large farms that can
Yep.
produce milk cheaper than we can overall. There's resistance to change, and so much of the price of milk today is dependent upon export markets. Most of our export of cheese, for example, goes to Mexico, and
Oh,
away, and those kind of products go to China.
huh.
And so the export price influences our domestic price as well for milk products, even in Vermont. So it's a
Interesting.
complicated system that's
Yep.
influenced by many factors that our farmers don't benefit from
That's
in
sad.
terms of scale. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
sad. Yeah, it
Yeah.
needs reform.
Yeah, I agree with you. It was funny with the egg prices going completely off the charts. A friend
Yeah.
of mine and I were in Wayside, and WCAX came in, and of course they took one look at me and said, "I know her." And but my friend said, "I actually don't mind it because egg prices haven't been increased for farmers in years, and they probably, I know it was from the bird flu that started it, but she said they probably need the increase to make a profit." And I hadn't even thought about the
Oh,
farmers.
that's true. But even consolidation there, you've got I think about 5 firms that control over 50% of the egg
Ex-
production in this country.
Right.
So it's very
Amazing.
difficult. Yeah,
Yeah, it's the
yeah,
whole thing is very complicated.
yeah.
And you mentioned before, we only have about 5 minutes, that cooperatives, when did they seem to raise, when did cooperatives come into being? Because there's a paragraph here that says, George Aiken, champion of cooperatives.
Yeah.
And we know
Well,
George.
he endorsed it. The cooperative laws really were the early 1900s, and Aiken was pretty much in favor of that, and cooperative structures, both for agriculture and even finance with the farm credit system, which is a sort of a cooperative structure as well. But Aiken uh, really felt that Vermont should try to go it alone
Oh,
on dairy and agriculture with specialty products. But the problem he encountered was, and Governor Smith at the time even felt that way. But the problem they encountered is that if you're starting to sell product on the national level, that one state can't interfere with trade with another state, and
huh.
therefore under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So even if we try to go it alone, we would find that our pricing would be soon impacted by production in other states.
Very
But it was a
complicated.
cooperative structure that was put in place in the early 1900s.
Oh, interesting, interesting. And now, just sort of, we have just 3 minutes left, but I think now everybody's looking at the environment and looking at runoffs from farms. And my experience is that farmers try very hard to protect the environment because it's to their benefit.
Absolutely.
I don't think they go out of their way to destroy it. That'd be
No, absolutely. I mean, you don't exist unless you're looking and trying to find ways to, make sure that you can maintain environmental soil integrity and all, because you depend upon the soil to produce your crops. And technology changes over a long period of time. And the reason that the Natural Resources Service and all these programs were put in place is to bring the best technology to the farm so they understand what to do. And most farmers, they don't survive unless they're focusing on environmental integrity.
Well, that's certainly my impression when you go and talk to a farmer.
Yeah.
They're very conscious of the environment and they understand
That's
it.
right.
What do you see going forward? Will farmers get involved in AI? I feel very knowledgeable. I did a show on AI, so I'm up to speed.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's discussing AI, but there's so much advanced technology coming forth in terms. I mean, GPS and all these things are there in terms of farms using the latest technology to know about soil health, how to determine where your crops are being grown, and one of the projects that we have going on too is that you even have the ability now on some of the animals you used to use your iPhone or other methods and to have transponders on your animals so that you can create fencing without putting wires in the ground. So you can determine where the cows need to move.
Oh, there you go.
Animals need to move.
Huh.
And then you have automatic milking systems where the cows can be milked. So you have all this latest technology, but it's costly. It's not easy to do.
Right.
So sometimes you need some assistance to do that.
Huh. I should tell you sometime the story of how Ray Burke taught me how to milk a cow. That'd be an interesting.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
That would be.
I remember his wife coming down with the cows that we had the annual farm show.
Yes, exactly.
She brought the cows and we used for milking, and wonderful family.
Well, he is still funny as all get out and almost blind now, but I interviewed him on radio one time. Hysterical, just great. Anyway, Roger Allbee, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did.
I did, and thank you. Thank you for what you do.
Well, no problem. You have got to get this book, folks. I loved it, and it's full of details, but it just keeps you going. I was like, next page, dragging it around for a couple of days. It was a great read, Turning the Soil. Thank you, Roger. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. See you next week.